The meaning of the Guantanamera song. What is the meaning of the song Guantanamera?
First of all, it is necessary to analyze the historical context that forms the background.
Guantanamera means woman from Guantanamo. The refrain, in short, reads like this: Guantanamera, guajira Guantanamera, peasant from Guantanamo.
Guantanamo, or rather the Guantanamo prison camp, is a U.S. detention facility of maximum security inside the naval base of Guantanamo, on the island of Cuba. The camp is known to world public opinion due to the systematic violations of the Geneva Conventions regarding prisoners of war, such as indefinite detention without prior trial and torture, perpetrated mainly on prisoners believed to be connected to Islamic terrorism. The detention area consisted of 3 camps: Camp Delta, which includes Camp Echo, Camp Iguana and Camp X-Ray, which inspired the film of the same name. The latter was closed on April 29, 2002. In that context, Cuba was a Spanish colony, until 1898 when there was the Spanish-American War and was occupied by the Americans who, once the war was won, declared the independence of Cuba. With this, the United States obtained a territory in Guantanamo Bay completely under their jurisdiction, American Protectorate. The famous song composed by Josito Fernandez was inspired by a text taken from a collection of poems by José Martí Pérez, the Versos Sencillos, simple verses. Let's try to summarize the life of the great Martí Pérez to fully understand the moods that underlie the wonderful song inspired by him. At the age of 4, he moved with his family to Spain, to his father's hometown, and then returned to the Caribbean island after only 2 years, where he attended a local public school. In addition to being a great writer, poet and journalist, Martí was also a painter and philosopher. In 1867 he enrolled in the Professional School for Painting and Sculpture in Havana to take drawing lessons. In 1869 he published his first political text in the single edition of the newspaper El Diablo Cojuelo. The same year, he published Abdallah, a patriotic drama in verse, in the minivan La Patria Libre. In the same year he composed the famous sonnet 10 de Octubre, which was published a little later in the newspaper of his school. Despite this success, in March of that year the colonial authorities closed the school and he was forced to interrupt his studies. Thus, he began to hate the Spanish domination of his homeland. Likewise, hatred of slavery, which was still practiced in Cuba, grew in him. He was arrested and incarcerated in the national prison following an accusation of treason made by the Spanish government. More than 4 months later, he assumed responsibility for the charges and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Over time, Martí fell ill and his legs were severely injured due to the chains that encircled him. He was then transferred from prison to another part of Cuba, known as Isla de Pinos. Later, the government decided to repatriate Martí to Spain. There he studied law and wrote articles on the injustices of the Spanish rule in Cuba. After spending some time in Spain, he completed his studies, earning degrees in law and in philosophy and letters. He later moved to France, where he spent some time before secretly returning to Cuba under an assumed name, in 1877. He could not get a job until he accepted a job as a professor of history and literature in Guatemala City. In 1880 Martí moved to New York, where he held the role of adjunct consul for Uruguay, Paraguay and Argentina. He mobilized the community of Cuban exiles, especially in Tampa and Key West, Florida, to carry out the revolution and gain independence from Spain and, at the same time, oppose the annexation of Cuba to the United States, as some politicians wished. U.S. To this end, he too founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party in 1892. In 1894 he left with the desire to land in Cuba and fight directly for the revolution, but was intercepted in Florida. He convinced the Cuban Revolutionary General Antonio Maceo Grajales, an exile in Costa Rica, to resume the fight against the Spaniards in Cuba. On March 25, 1895 he published the Montecristi Manifesto, proclaiming Cuban independence and thus putting an end to all legal distinctions between the races, encouraging contact with the Spaniards who did not oppose independence and inciting the struggle against those who did not approve of the path of independence. On April 11 of the same year, Martí landed in Cuba with a unit of rebel exiles, including Generalissimo Máximo Gómez. José Martí was killed by Spanish troops during the Battle of Dos Rios on May 19. He is buried in the Cementerio Santa Efigenia in Santiago de Cuba. Throughout his life, the Cuban writer and poet opposed U.S. involvement in the War for Cuban independence, referring to the U.S. state as the Goliath of the Americas.
The Spanish-American War began and ended approximately 3 years after his death.
A simple song that for many of us is a carefree love song typical of Latin American culture has a long history full of meanings and references. Before dying, a simple man wants to express what is most important to him, a profound suffering for the slavery of men. But he doesn't hold a grudge. He grows the white rose all year round, both for his friend and for the impostor.
Guantanamera, a song for freedom and social justice.